So he goes home. Well, he's home. He decides that he's really going to hit the party scene because no one knows he's home. Everyone thinks he's on his gap year and everybody thinks he's still in Australia. So he's going to use this as a time to just party like an animal. And while he's out, he happens to meet a girl. Not Chelsea, unfortunately. Yo, when we get to Chelsea, all I can think is, why didn't that work out? I'm so sad that didn't work out. But anyway, this is not Chelsea that he meets. But he says this. Listen carefully, friends. One night I met a girl, chatted with her over drinks. I didn't know she was a page 3 girl. That was the accepted, misogynistic, objectifying term for young topless girl featured each day on page 3 of Rupert Murdoch's The Sun. We know what a page 3 girl is. You know what I'm saying? Like, what is this talking down to me, this woke talk? Like, you don't need to come to me and explain to me about the objectifying, misogynistic, condescending term that is used for a girl who splashes herself across the pages without a shirt on. I know what that term means. You don't need to explain it to me. And I think that is what I'm talking about when I say this isn't a masculine book. A man wouldn't write that. He would just say she was a page 3 girl. Fully well knowing that we already know what that means, but that is such a insertion of the Markle into this book. Maybe Harry did write that, but what I'm saying is he needs to constantly be shown who to be. So like in our example about George, he was becoming George. He wore the cowboy hat, he was changing his accent, he was wearing different clothes. He wanted to be this really cool guy from the Outback. Then he meets Megan, and Megan does the same thing with him. Megan says, this is what we think, this is what we do, these are the words we use, these are the words we don't use, and this is why we don't. Enough years of that, and we get a sentence like this. Page 3 girl was the accepted misogynistic objectifying term of a young topless girl. That's not what a man would say. So I'm just saying, I feel sorry for Harry because he is just so incapable of deciding who he is. And if he had spent enough time sorting out who he was and sorting out what he wanted to be in life and not taking on the title of spare and not taking on people's unkind words and not taking on the mantle of other people's impressions of him and not constantly looking for who's the coolest person in the room that I can mimic. Where was his sense of self? He had none. So anyway, that line was just so typical of what I think is happening here. This is not his book. This is somebody else's rendition of what his life was. But anyway, he goes on to say that he was seeing the girl, and then that night when he left the bar or the club or wherever he was, the paparazzi starts running after him, and he's almost in a terrible accident. Like they jump the curb in the car trying to get around him and take pictures. Like it was like this whole terrible thing. But the next day, the story that was being run wasn't about the fact that he was almost killed in a car accident. The next day, the story was all about how he was seen with this shady girl, and couldn't he do better, and why is he throwing his life away, and why is he always partying all the time, and what's wrong, and what's happening to our prince, and what in the world is Harry doing with his life? And he was super offended because he was like, I was almost killed in a car accident like Mummy was, and nobody took any notice of that. They just scared that I'd been out drinking all night with a lady of the night. And I wasn't. She wasn't a lady of the night. She was just a girl who liked to take her shirt off sometimes. So he decides, forget this. I thought I could have a little bit of fun here in London, but I guess I can't. I guess everything I want to do is just going to be ruined by the press. They ruined my time in Australia, and they ruined my time with the page 3 girl, and now I guess I just better go to Africa and help the kids with AIDS. So he had planned on taking his friend Henners, but we remember that Henners died in a car accident last time we talked. So now he's going to ask George. Not surprisingly. And George goes, and he says that Lesotho, where he had been planning on spending the second half of his gap year, was a gorgeous place, but it was also a really terribly tragic place because the AIDS epidemic had just ravaged the country, and that there was all these orphans, and there was all this need, and there was all this poverty, and so he just threw himself into the work, and he and George, from dawn till dark, were building schools and working relentlessly. He says George and I signed up to help at several charities and schools. We were both bowled over by the lovely people we met, their resilience, their grace, their courage, and good cheer in the face of so much suffering. Imagine if he'd learned a lesson. We worked as hard as we'd worked on his farm, gladly and eagerly. We built schools, we repaired schools, we mixed gravel, poured cement, whatever was needed. So he sees the value of hard work, and you're just like, congratulations. Maybe this is who you can be. Maybe you can work really hard at your charities. And you're hopeful for him. You know, could he be turning a new leaf? Could he be seeing that helping others and not constantly obsessing about yourself and your image is the way to live life? You can think if you want to find people that hate you, you will find them. You don't have to be famous for that. If you want to be discouraged by people's opinion of you, you can be very easily discouraged. There will always be somebody out there who can't wait to tell you how much you suck. But why live your life by that person? That person is over there basing their life on what you're doing. You don't worry about that. You go do your own thing. So anyway, he says that in the spirit of service, he had decided he was going to take it upon himself and he was going to do an interview. Yes, an interview. He was going to give the press what they wanted, but it was all for the people of Lesotho. And so he thought he could maybe shed some light on this crisis and use his status to their good. So he's sitting on this hilltop with this reporter. But not surprisingly, this little interview goes downhill real quick. And he says that he was talking about how he loved the children, and the guy said, oh yeah, well, why do you love the children so much? And Harry didn't really know to answer that, and so trying to be funny, he's like, I don't know, I guess because I'm immature too, so I can relate to them. Well, that was like chumming the waters. The sharks began to circle. And he says that then they wanted to talk about, your mother loved children too. Do you think about her a lot? And so then he was like already like, oh my gosh, I don't want to talk about this. Why are you guys always bringing her up? We want to talk about the children with AIDS. We don't want to talk about Mummy. And he's offended for the people's behalf that the interviewer isn't taking more notice of the crisis right down the mountain. Why in the world are they wanting to talk to Princess Diana's son about her death? Why aren't they covering the crisis? Then the guy wanted to talk about the fact that there had been some recordings that had come out since his mother's death, and they were sort of like confessional tapes, and he wanted to get Harry's take on it. Well, Harry inarticulately was trying to express, isn't it too bad that somebody dies and we're all still obsessed with the trauma and trouble that she was having during her life? Like, cannot we let this woman rest in peace? And so he said that, it was just a shame that the press was always feeding this rabid crowd of people who just couldn't get enough. And the whole thing didn't come off the way he had hoped that it would. Like, all his words were just spun right out of his mouth, probably by that campaign spin doctor. And he says that it just was supposed to be this positive thing, and of course it was like pearls before swine is what this was. This was just throwing his pearls before swine. These people didn't care. They were going to twist everything he said. They were going to turn every question into something he didn't want to talk about. And basically it was just a giant waste of time. And he tried to, out of the generosity of his goodwill, throw these people a bone with an interview, and then they just wrecked it. They just wrecked it like they always do. Why was he even trying to have any sort of relationship with these rabid animals? And then, of course, they want to be like, so, tell us about this page 3 girl. What's going on there, Harry? Love life? Troubles in paradise? And then he was all like, then I just saw red. How dare they talk about her like that? He says this thing that I couldn't quite sort what he was talking about. He said that the reporter referenced his most recent scandal, which was, of course, the girl that he had been seen with. And Harry writes, he mentioned that some were wondering if I'd really learned something from my visit to the rehab clinic. Had I truly converted? I don't remember if he used that word converted, but at least one paper had. Did Harry need to be converted? Harry the heretic? I could barely make out the reporter through the sudden red mist. How are we even talking about this? I blurted something out about not being normal, which caused the reporter's mouth to fall open. Here we go. He was getting his headline, his news fix, where his eyes rolling up into his head, and I was supposed to be the addict? I explained what I meant by normal. I didn't lead a normal life, because I couldn't lead one. Even my father reminds me that unfortunately Willie and I won't be normal. I told the reporter that no one but Willie understood what it was like to live in this surreal fishbowl, in which normal events were treated as abnormal, and the abnormal was routinely normalized. But I didn't know why we weren't talking about all the poverty, disease, and orphans and death. And then he says that he just felt ashamed sitting there with the journalist, sitting above all that misery and talking about page 3 girls. Okay. First of all, that section that I just read, I don't get. Because he was just mad in the last bit, that on the last video, he was mad because he said that, do we recall, Rehabber Kooks, the journalist whose real name is Rebecca Brooks, that she had written that he'd been sent to rehab. And he was like, that was totally and categorically untrue. And now he's talking about how another reporter is coming to him saying he went to rehab. Okay, well, if it's not true, why don't you correct the record? Why? I don't understand why in this portion of the book, he acts as though, like, yeah, I was at rehab, but what's that to him? Okay, was Rehabber Kooks onto something or was she not? I don't understand. I don't understand how he can just brush over this and it's nothing. Were you in a rehab? Was Rehabber Kooks really the kooky one? This book doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, he starts to feel really bad because he's like, here I was trying to bring attention to the needy and they just want to talk about stuff that is pithy and of no value. I think we can all agree that that's unfortunate. It is unfortunate that we would rather read about Harry's experience with the page 3 girl and we're less concerned about the orphans. That is unfortunate. But at the same time, he had to have known that when the reporter gets to sit down with you and the first exclusive that anybody's ever gotten, you think he's not going to try to get a few sentences about something that he knows will sell papers? That's his job. So the fact that he went into that, he acts like no one prepped him for what this would be like. I find that completely disingenuous. How in the world would the palace send him to his first interview and not have somebody sit down with him and say, Harry, they're going to talk to you about this, this, and this. You need to make sure that you have answers for that. How are you going to talk about it when they bring up the page 3 girl? How are you going to talk? What are you going to do when they ask you about these recordings that are coming out from your mom? They will ask you about these things. These are the answers. If you don't have answers, we will provide them. But you cannot, I do not believe it for a second that he never got any counsel as to what to say. I think maybe he didn't remember what he was supposed to say in the moment when they asked the question. But for him to act like I just went into it and then was plowed over and nobody tried to help me, and I couldn't believe that I wasn't able to steer the conversation back to what I wanted to talk about, this was just such an unfair miscarriage of justice. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. And I'm trying really, really hard this time to be understanding. I really am. But then passages like this make it so hard to be. Okay, so then he says that he got done with that interview and he just felt so just torn to pieces about how it went that he went and smoked a shopping bag full of weed. I mean, isn't that what you do when you feel a little down? And then he said, I think it was that night. I don't know, it might have been another night. Kind of did it a lot. But he didn't have any problems. Nah, he's good. He's good. He's straight. Y'all don't have to worry about that. He's good. Just smoking a shopping bag full of weed as one does.